Next up is David Graeber, author of Debt, the First 5,000 Years. He's going to take us in his time machine to the beginning. And it's perfect to pick up on this word forgiveness. We're not asking for forgiveness, because one thing David discovers in his book is that morality and debt are always deeply entwined, and debt is a kind of vacillating concept. Sometimes, you owe an obligation to someone, and that can be a sort of romantic thing, or maybe you should talk about the issue of primordial debt. Are we all indebted just because we exist and we speak? we owe everything to everybody, or is debt something that controls us and is connected to violence? All these issues. Debt is morality.
Oh, okay.
Go.
Wow. Okay.
7 minutes.
All right. Where do I start? I was thinking, when I was hearing all this language about the sort of shame and this paralysis that you face when you're in debt, and the feeling that this is something I did so terribly wrong. It's a deeply personal thing. I always think maybe the best way to contextualize that feeling is to consider the fact that over the course of human history, I think it's probably true that most people who have ever lived have been debtors. Now think about that for a moment. I mean, could they all have done something terribly wrong? It's almost certainly the case, because densest populations are usually in big empires, and that's in such situations. Somehow or other, it always seems to happen that a very small percentage of the population ends up with creditors to everybody else. And in fact, if you look at world history, and when I started researching debt, it was just quite remarkable. You see the same thing over and over again, and across Eurasia, certainly, and in China and India and the Middle East, that everybody's a debtor. The debt is identified with morality in the sense of moral obligation, what you owe to other people, as it were, is seen in terms of debt. So often you find the language of debt, guilt, and sin. It's like the same word. This is true in a lot of Indo-European languages. It's true in Sanskrit. It's true in Aramaic. So the famous, forgive us our trespasses, just as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's actually debt in the original. Forgive us our debts, just as we forgive those who owe us money. Except, of course, we don't. And that whole point is see, you're a bad person, God forgive you. So that kind of paradox of debt runs, on the one hand, debt is morality. On the other hand, people who lend money are universally recognized as being evil. And it's almost impossible to find any positive image of a moneylender anywhere in human history. And I guess until the head of the Grameen Bank came along. Heroic feat. But so there's this obvious, profound moral ambivalence that's been going on the issue, and it's especially so if you look at world religions, where almost invariably they kind of start by saying debt and morality are the same thing, and then they kind of say, yeah, except of course not really. And so the same in the beginning of Plato's Republic. They start by saying, well, what is justice? Justice is just paying your debt. Someone throws this out. And Socrates says, that's ridiculous. Of course it's not. And then they spend the rest of the book trying to figure out, if not that, then what? And never quite figure it out. But it's quite the same with most religious traditions. The Hindu tradition, they start your life as a debt you owe to the gods, and they say, well, no. Ultimately, it's recognizing that you and the cosmos are the same. You realize there is no debt. Biblical traditions, forgiveness of debts, cancellation of debts. So it seems like these people feel they have to start with this language of debt as morality, but then realize, and then get rid of it again. Why? I think the reason why is because debt is this incredible, the very idea of shame, of sin that's associated with it, makes debt this incredibly powerful ideological mechanism that anytime you have violent inequalities of power, and massive inequalities of wealth and power have to always be maintained by violence of some kind or another, the first move you do is try to convince the people on the bottom that it's somehow their fault. And debt is the easiest way to do that. Because if the easiest, most obvious example, if you conquer people, you say, okay, you owe me your life because I've didn't kill you. And you know, so obviously I expect you to pay up. I'm going to be a nice guy and let you off the hook for the first few months, but after that, come on. You know, so suddenly you're the nice guy, and they're running around scrambling, feeling bad about themselves. It works amazingly well, except it also has this remarkable tendency to blow up in people's faces. Because it's also true that the overwhelming majority of rebellions, insurrections, jacqueries, throughout world history have been about dad, much more often than they are about more sort of structural forms of inequality like slavery or serfdom or caste systems. People rebel about that all the time. And part of the reason is because it's so, on the one hand it's accusatory, on the other hand you're saying, well, you should be my equal, you know, it's an equal contract, except you fucked up. And somehow saying that to someone is much more offensive than saying you're just inferior. Because the only, you know, response you can really make to that, if it's destroying your life, is at a certain point at least, is say, wait a minute, who owes what to who here? This makes it a very explosive thing, so you get debt revolts, but it also means that the people rebelling end up using the master's language, right, and saying, well, I mean, it's the same if you look at Jubilee 2000, efforts to forgive third world debt. He said, well, you owe us. Which is true, but again, you're framing things in terms of debt. Morality is debt. So that's why you have all of these moral thinkers, you know, having to start by saying morality is debt, because that's the language of politics that everybody on all sides are using at the time, and then trying to get rid of it again. And we've been in this dilemma, this moral dilemma, in one form or another ever since. I think it's useful to bear in mind, because these long-term historical problematics really, I mean, they haven't gone away. Even now, another thing I've discovered in researching the book is the idea of the generalized debt crisis that we are experiencing today, I would say, is not new either. In fact, it was a kind of, you might say that for most of world history, when moral and social thinkers thought about the sort of ultimate nightmare scenario of society completely breaking down, what they imagined was pretty much what we are experiencing right now. And this is true whether it's, you know, Confucian thinkers in the Middle Ages or, you know, Aristotle or people like that. You know, a tiny percentage of the population enslaves everybody else. They're trapped in these terrible debt traps they can't get out of. They're forced to sell members of their family into slavery or themselves into slavery. I always say if Aristotle were magically transported to contemporary America, he would probably find the distinction between, you know, an indebted householder selling himself into slavery and renting himself to work for someone else is kind of a legal technicality. You know, he would conclude that most Americans are in fact debt slaves. And would he be wrong? There were methods that were put in place to get rid of this, to head this off, because it was assumed it would lead to generalized social breakdown. One of them was the Jubilee. That was a sort of big, or just clean slates. In Mesopotamia, for thousands of years, it was considered standard practice. The new king came in to would say, all right, everything canceled. They'd leave commercial loans, sometimes alone, but other consumer loans would just be wiped out, so they start again. In biblical texts, as some of us no doubt know, there was a tradition of cancellation every 7 to 49 years. In the Middle Ages, another period where money was largely virtual. It's another part I can't really get into. This when you have virtual money, which is what we have now. Money is basically a promise at IOU rather than a thing like gold. You have to have some kind of mechanism like this or the thing goes crazy. In the Middle Ages, when that happened again, you have virtual money. They said, okay, we'll get rid of interest taking, we'll get rid of debt peonage. All of this was under pressure from popular movements. And so there's always some overarching institution to protect debtors so that you don't have everybody becoming enslaved and the system breaking down. This time around, ever since '71, we've been moving back toward this regime of virtual money since Nixon went off the gold standard. You know, what happens instead, they create the IMF and institutions like that to make sure, you know, not to protect debtors, but to protect creditors, and come up with this insane idea that no one should ever default, which flies in the face of even normal economic logic. The only way they can do it is by appealing to this very old idea of morality, that debt and paying one's debts and morality are the same thing. Of course, what we discovered in 2008 is that morality only applies to certain players in the game, which has always also been the case. Another thing I found quite regularly wherever you look is that there's a huge difference between debts between equals and debts between, rich people and poor people. Debts between the rich and each other, rich people can be incredibly generous and forgiving and understanding when dealing with other rich people, just as poor people can with each other as well often. But when it's between social classes, suddenly it's like a religious responsibility. It's sacred. You can't possibly imagine, how could you be defaulting. What we discovered in 2008 was that money at this point really is something they just make up with their magic wands. It's a series of promises of IOUs that we make with one another. It's a social compact of a kind. If so, and when it's really inconvenient, trillions of dollars can be made to disappear. Money's just dead, and you can just get rid of it. So the fascinating thing is that they absolutely refused to do it on the level of debts between big players and the little ones. And this is why I think the sort of democratic core of this movement, which Middle Eastern revolts actually had a lot more to do with debt than people let on. I always like to point out that Saudi Arabia actually did do a jubilee. That was their reaction to the Arab Spring. They did a generalized debt, well, they also doubled security forces. But they took a two-handed approach. They also canceled all debts. So of course they have a king, that makes it easier. So they didn't want to really get out that they'd done this because it was set a bad example, I figured. But it can still be done. The old solutions are still available. So I wanted to throw that out, that we are living in not historically unprecedented times, and I think we need to think a lot larger than we have been. And I think that has been gone on the table. The idea that once we understand that debts can be waved away, they have been, they are being. If democracy is to mean anything, it means that who makes promises to who, what promises are kept, and what promises are renegotiated under what circumstances has to be democratically decided. It's not a process that only 1% of the population can weigh in on. Especially now that we realize that they're not actually these amazing geniuses who are the only people who know how to run an economy that are actually completely incompetent and everything fall under stealing. So maybe that will be one.
Yeah, there's a line in your book where you say that it's actually refusing to calculate that makes us human.
Ah, yes. Yeah, that's one of the points of the book is that we've come to see all morality as debt because we come to see all of our relations in terms of exchange. And this is something that has been thrust on us, and I think social science is just as guilty as economics. So in general, it's absurd. And one way that we can start to unimagine this world where we're all debtors, which is to realize that much of our everyday interactions takes a completely different logic than economists talk about. I always like to say, communism is not some ideal that it might exist at some point in the future. It's the way most of us act with people we really care about all the time. Probably a third of what we do is communistically organized. A third of it's hierarchically. We have to do something about that, and a third of it is exchange. I mean, it's the part of the economy where debt is even a meaningful term is a fairly slim portion. And so one way to start, a lot of the things that we're talking about here might sound crazy and utopian, but they're not, because we're all, communistic religions are the basis of all sociality, and by reimagining them in terms of debt, we just throw ourselves into these series of logical traps, like religious thinkers who thought about debt to, your debt to the cosmos, or were forced to before saying that doesn't really work.
Crazy and utopian Mike Consul from the Roosevelt Institute.